Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight, and welcome to the Chesapeake Chapter Dinner Lecture for June. Remember, keep your hands up for a green ticket, and we'll get you a book if you're the lucky winner. Tonight's guest speaker is Mike Ryschkewitsch, and he's coming in. He came to APL about 5 months ago from NASA, and everything I've already heard is that he's making a really great impact. Former chief engineer at NASA, and here with APL with their Space Systems group. Let's have a warm welcome and round of applause for our speaker.
Good evening. Thank everybody for braving the heat and coming out tonight. So at 6 o'clock we weren't sure we'd have a quorum because the power went off briefly, and we figured the main reason people are here because we have air conditioning. So before anybody rats me out to the CLO, I haven't used the APL template for the PowerPoint charts because this is actually work that was drawn on while I was at NASA headquarters, and it actually had kind of an interesting start. So how many of you know Mike Griffin? Okay, so a bunch of you. How many of you have ever been a target of one of Mike's critiques of something you did or said? Okay. Yeah, so you probably know that Mike can be, shall we say, direct. And this one got started out one Sunday morning when I had shipped off my weekly report, and one of the items in the weekly report was that we had just released the new revision of the NASA System Engineering Handbook. And I shipped it off, went to bed, and of course, as Mike Griffin always slept 2 hours a night, I got up the next morning at 5:30, and there was a message from him that was already about 3 hours old, and it said, "Fine as far as it went, where's the rest?" I go, oh boy, where's this one going? So it turned into an interesting conversation because after a few more exchanges, and it took me about 3 or so before I figured out what it is that he was looking at. He was building off of some thoughts, and I'll refer you to a speech that he gave in 2007 at Purdue University, talking about the two cultures of engineering and the art and the science of engineering. And Mike's thesis was, we talk about the science of engineering, and we almost never talk about the art, and particularly with system engineering, we never talk about the art. But that left us down a path, and so I want to talk a little bit about beginning with the art, and then we'll get to the end of where that conversation led us in as we were starting to try to develop a system engineering leadership development program for NASA, and some interesting conversations in that. So I will just quote a fairly standard definition of system engineering: the art and the science of developing an operable system within the constraints. System engineering is about trade-offs, compromise, about generalists rather than specialists. So if we were to write down what's a fundamental process of creating new things, system engineers would probably go to some kind of a block diagram, and it's got an infinite set of loops in the thing. And yet, as we would write down processes for all of these little things and all kinds of guides of how do you evaluate an evolving system concept, and yet we tend not to really talk about the creative leaps or the kinds of iterations, because by the time you put all the iterations into something, you'd have an infinite number of squiggles on your diagram, and nobody would have a clue what it was that you were actually talking about. But if maybe we ought to be a little bit more explicit. I love this cartoon. If you look at the piece in the middle, that's of course what happens in a lot of the times when we're actually developing a concept. All of a sudden, you get to the end, and everybody says, "Wow, that's pretty cool." And nobody actually has a clue of what happened in the middle of whatever discussion you were that actually got you to the end game. So if we think about the fundamental process in creating things, ultimately you've got this circulation that goes on between a need, between some kind of a concept for an object, and the concept for how you might use that object. That's kind of the fundamental circulation. And if you ask yourself the question, it's a fundamental, I would assert that it's a fundamental circulation, but is it a process? Because if you think about a process, then maybe you ought to be able to break it down into substeps and actually teach people how to do that. And yet there are so many things where we make these creative leaps that nobody actually knows. I picked the picture of the guy with the atlatl down at the bottom because when you think about, you know, when humans started using tools and this fundamental process of how we solve these problems, it's kind of easy to imagine how somebody might have been able to start picking up rocks, figuring that pounding on bones with their hands hurt and rocks were hard, and then maybe they figured out how you would put a stick, and there's kind of a logical progression. You can imagine how you can do that, but how in the world did somebody ever think about taking your spear and putting another stick on the end of it and holding that stick as a way of extending your arm so that you would you know, get more speed out of the spear? I mean, there's some kind of a leap in there that I just can't imagine how that kind of thing would happen. So you know, if you fast forward, you know, thousands of years from whoever first invented the atlatl, and you start thinking about what makes modern engineering, it's really the adding to that fundamental internal creative loop, the next loop on the outside, which is a combination of analyzing, testing, and choosing. Now, presumably, the testing and choosing is part of you know, what originally has been done, you know, implicitly by human beings, but the analyzing part is a new part. As an interesting aside, you can say, how old is that? And you get into arguments, and some people say, well, modern engineering is a couple hundred years old. I would actually assert that in some ways it's a couple of thousand years old. If I put Archimedes' screw, it's an interesting artifact because it's not at all obvious that Archimedes actually invented that, because there were, you know, precursors to that. But what is clear is that Archimedes was probably the forerunner of modern engineers and scientists, because in a time when the other Greeks that were advancing mathematics were thinking of mathematics as a pure study and done for the love and understanding what the universe was about, Archimedes was at what we would call the modern end of that, because he was very clearly using mathematics as a tool to try to figure out how things work. To be able to actually do design with it. I mean, he was very, very close to having, to inventing calculus, you know, a millennium and a half before Leibniz and Newton. And if you actually want any proof that he was a real engineer or the first engineer, you have to only look at the way he died, because he invented a bunch of war machines for King Hero of Syracuse when they were fighting the Romans. And when the city finally fell, the Roman general Marcellus sent somebody to go find this inventor that had made their life so hard, and they found him in his workroom, and the soldiers told him to come with him, and he was standing over his sand table, which he used for his drawings, and he said, "Don't bother me, I'm working," whereupon the soldiers stabbed him. So there were probably many, many managers that can sympathize with that early frustration with the engineers. So if we go back to the nomenclature of the art and the science, I'll hypothesize that the analyzing part is the part that we commonly call the science of engineering, and as we, you know, when we broaden that into the system engineering techniques, the science of system engineering, and that the art is in the bottom half. And if you go back to the beginnings of our modern system engineering culture in the mid-50s, particularly with driven by the development of ballistic missiles and the fact that people would throw these things up in the air, they wouldn't work, and now you're faced with literally millions of things, and how do you invent the processes that allow you to control that whole process, then started adding in all of these processes in the coordinating and controlling. How do you actually get teams of hundreds and thousands of engineers working on a common goal in a way that things will actually come together in the end? So you invented the formal requirements flow down types of things, and controlling and the verification planning. But at the same time, what we don't talk nearly as much about is the fact that once you get a team that's beyond, you know, perhaps the number of people in this room is already too big, that the communicating and the team dynamics start becoming a more and more important part of that problem. How do you actually get people to work together to be pulling toward a common goal? For those of you who might have been at the PPS lecture the other night, how do you get people to not sub-optimize by working only to their problem, but actually looking at the bigger problem and perhaps make their job harder by making somebody else's job easier, and thereby get a better product in the end game. So if you ask yourself the question, if these kinds of activities are led by systems engineers, and by the way, I'm going to use the terminology as it's used in much of the space business, particularly the robotic space business, where the systems engineer, the lead systems engineer, is the chief technical officer for the product. In human space flight, that's a chief engineer coupled with systems analysts, and there's some other terminologies, but rolled up into the one activity of the person that has to make all of those things happen and play together well. You can ask yourself the question, is that person primarily a technical leader, or are they primarily a systems manager? Are they the creative architect? Are they the problem finder, the constructive paranoid, if I borrow Gentry Lee's terminology, the big picture thinker? Or are they the manager, the organizer, the process controller, or the detail verifier? Frankly, the answer in my mind is you have to do both, because I say in the middle, the brilliantly conceived system executed poorly is as worthless as a badly conceived system executed perfectly. You don't get a good thing either way. So this leads you then down in the problem is that as we go through these problems, we talk about analyzing things, we talk about documenting things, we talk about configuration control processes, we talk about coordination processes, how do you get the team to go, the plans, the schedules, all of the trades you do. You talk about decomposing design, decomposing requirements, you talk about verifying, and we don't often talk about overtly about creating, communicating, the team dynamics, challenging constantly challenging what you're doing. Is it really the right solution? Has it got the right trade-off? Have we hit the break points? Have we over-designed in places? Problem hunting. This is one that actually is kind of near and dear to my heart, because people tend to think about problem solving and they tend not to think about problem hunting, and yet one of the real values of the leaders of the technical activity is going and figuring out how things might be bad. It's kind of like the constructive paranoid. It's the person that is out walking the dog on Sunday morning, and all of a sudden they have this flash and say, oops, we need to go think about what happens if, right? And so, constantly doing that, through the whole life cycle thing. Figuring out where the gaps are, okay? Because we spend a lot of time trying to make projects and teams efficient by divvying up the work and making sure that we have one person doing one body of work, and yet we tend not to think nearly as heavily about where are the seams, where are the potential gaps, is there something that can be missing between things people are doing, and then the general situational awareness of what's going on. Did we start off in one world to build something and the world's changed around us, and maybe we're actually building the wrong thing for today's world, even though it was the right thing for the world we started off in. Well, the things we talk about are also those that are easy to write down. So in a lot of ways, when we write down do something like a systems engineering handbook, or most of the textbooks, we're a little bit like the drunk looking for his car keys under the street light, right? He looks there because that's where he can see. That doesn't mean that's where he dropped his keys, right? They tend to be easier to measure. We can come up with design metrics. We can come up with process metrics. We can teach them in a classroom. They're amenable to guidelines and metrics. And in the world we live in, when you've got GAO and auditors and various and sundry people, half the time what they really want to know is, do your metrics look good? They don't ask the question, is the project doing well? They ask the question, are the metrics looking good? We don't talk about, the stuff we don't talk about, of course, is hard to write down, tends to be hard to measure. How do you measure the robustness of a design? There's lots of discussions here about, as we're trying to build robustness and resilience, what does that mean, and how do you go about doing that? A lot of them are learned by doing, and so you have this, this ongoing discussion we've all been involved in is do people only learn because they work under the arm of a great systems engineer and they learn from that person, or can you teach it in the classroom? Interestingly enough, like a lot of other things in our world, you notice them mostly when they're absent. If they're there in spades, right, because they're hard to measure, you tend to not think about it. It just works, right? And frankly, what led us into the next part of the conversation is that they're commonly absent from training and development programs. So it's kind of interesting that we're caught in this conversation, because there's other parts of the world we live in where we actually flip to the other side of this conversation. So how many people like music? Most of the people in the room. How many people are musicians? Okay, a much smaller number. So if you think about the comparison, when you think about music, most of the people in this world that are not musicians will actually live in the upper left. They actually don't really care about what is the musical form, right? You don't really care whether it's a ballad or it's a sonata or something else. You care that the music pleases you, and that there's something creative about it that grabs you. You're interested in the creative combinations. It's a catchy, it's got a catchy tune or a catchy guitar riff. And they think about the musical message, and yet they tend not to think at all about the technique. And yet, in most of the conversations we live in the world, and how do we teach things and do things, and the engineering side, we tend to live in the lower right-hand side. We teach people about meeting requirements. We teach them about organizing. We teach them about process control. And we don't teach them about being a problem finder, or, you know, try to figure out how do you become a creative architect on something. It's because it's so much a harder job. So that led us into a conversation when we were, so, you know, then the next, of course, big argument is that everybody gets into, and usually it's better if you have a bottle of wine to help you with, is, are systems engineers made or found? And I will assert that they're just like musicians. The answer is yes, they are found, and then they are made, because you're going to need to look for talent, but you can teach the techniques, you can coach the soft skills, and you can have people practice and practice and practice, and that's probably the most, you know, the most important part of that is practicing at a lot of different levels and trying things and getting that feedback in that. So where that led us is in our training and development program. We said, you know, when we want to bring people into this program, the mantra was, how do we find the people that are one step away from being able to lead interdisciplinary teams in the development of a very complicated project of some kind. So these were people that were subsystem discipline leads. They had developed and led a smaller team, but now we were going to ask them to get out of being a power system engineer and figuring out how to do that broadly across a spacecraft or an instrument. And then that led us into a discussion. Following on to the one that started with Mike Griffin, is, you know, very quickly we realized that it was really easy to measure their technical acumen. It was really easy to say, had they built something, right? It was a heck of a lot harder, both as we were selecting them to measure the other attributes. Number one, we had to figure out what they all were. And then the second one was, once we figured out what they were, then you wanted to be able to compare where they were against where you thought they needed to be, so that you could actually have an overt development. And so what we did is shock the heck out of the social scientists. We said, we need some social scientists. And we literally grabbed the social scientists, and they, you know, once their tongues, you know, got back in their mouths and their jaws picked up off the floor, what we did is we went out to all of the NASA centers, and we said, tell us who are the handful of people, if you had a very tough technical task that you needed to lead with a significant group of people, who would be the people that you would want to lead that task, okay? And then we turned the social scientists loose on them in an interview process to ask them what they did. And then, interestingly enough, we turned the social scientists loose on them to actually follow them around for several days, some of them up to a week, and found out what they actually did when they actually got in the working environment. It was interesting because, as we're going to talk about some of the soft skills, and it was interesting that some of the folks that were recognized as the very best people swore up and down that they didn't do any of the soft things we talk about. And yet when the folks were watching them in the actual work environment, they were actually doing them at a very high level. And then when we talked to them afterwards, they said, well, yeah, okay, but they weren't about to admit it at the beginning. So what was interesting was, going into this, we weren't quite sure that we were going to get a consistent answer, because within NASA there are 3 or 4 different tribal cultures: human spaceflight, the robotic spaceflight, aerodynamics, and aeronautics. And so we weren't sure we were going to get a consistent set of answers. They were remarkably similar. And what was actually very intriguing is that after the first round, when we did it with folks whose job was, the lead systems engineer or something equivalent to that, we turned around and we did it with the technical leadership of the agency. So people like Bill Gerstenmaier leading human spaceflight, and actually had him follow Griffin around for a few days. He hated the idea that he did this soft skill stuff, but he was actually pretty good at it. And the results were actually quite interesting. So if you had senior leaders leading a organization into very complex long-range tasks, it was a remarkably similar set of skill set. We then used that to formalize the basis for both identifying high potential candidates that we brought into this training program, and then we also used that as part of the evaluation process to develop their skills gaps in their learning plan, and then and modifying our training program. So I'll get into what was found. So obviously, the fact that they had to have technical acumen doesn't surprise you, and I'll go into these in detail, so I won't discuss these right here. I'll go into them as we get into the detailed list. It won't surprise you at all that that they had to have high levels of problem-solving skills and systems thinking. What started to be an emerging picture that surprised some people was their attitudes and attributes, that they had a comprehensive view of things, that they had a positive attitude and a dedication to mission success. Now, when you tell you the answer, you're going to go, duh, yeah, well, of course they do. Key was that they were also aware of their personal limitations. They knew what their team knew better than they did, and they were able to adapt to change and uncertainty. Communications, listening effectively, and in leadership, that they were creating a vision and direction. I'll go through some of these in some more detail. So, technical acumen, I don't think anything on these will surprise you. Probably the key here was that they both had a depth of technical knowledge and expertise that allowed them to perform and manage and coordinate, but they possessed a strong fundamental understanding of the engineering principles. So they were able to extend what they knew in the discipline area that they had grown up with, and to extend those fundamental principles into other areas as they were working with people in other disciplines. And a large part of it was sharing that project experience and the reliable resource for the team, and the go-to person. Who do you go to when you need to get pointed in the right direction? So none of those should be a real surprise to you. Problem solving and system thinking identifies the real problem. So what's the problem that is not the one that popped out of some analysis, but the one that's really going to start. And it's the other side of that coin of the problem hunting. What are the things that can actually stop us from getting success? Of course, most of these will not be a surprise. Ability to find connections and patterns. That's one of these things that is you both find inherently in people that naturally see the connections between things and not the pieces of them that are they automatically focus. That's the kind of talent you're looking for, but then you need to train to do that. Remain open-minded and objective. That's probably one of the key things that actually feeds into the team performance, because making sure that anybody can bring you a problem, especially if it's counter to something that you were thinking that was the answer, and particularly if it was something that the technical leader had said, we think we're heading in this direction, but being open to people that come in and say, the direction shouldn't be there, it needs to be over here, and being open to that. So, excuse me. And in terms of the attitudes and attributes, all of these were really high on the list. Remains inquisitive and curious. That again is part of this, this problem hunting. It's not once I've set a plan in motion, I actually know everything that's going. It's I got to find out what's going to actually happen and be able to make adjustments as I go. Seeks information, uses the art of questioning, both as a tool to make sure that they actually understand what's being done, but also as a tool to make sure that people have done their homework, and that they really have have thought through their problem. Gains respect, credibility, trust. As they say, when you're leading a team, you can shoot exactly one messenger, because after that, you don't actually have a team anymore. So, possesses self-confidence. That's kind of an interesting one because it also it's kind of the flip side of the third one from the bottom is the aware of the personal limitations. So people having the balance between making sure that they know how to lead this team, they know how to set the direction, they know how to manage the process, but also know where they need to rely on other people going forward. Positive attitude and a dedication to mission success. That's another one where there's a balance, because somebody who's a Pollyanna and comes in every morning and says everything's fine, it's 70 degrees and the humidity is low, when it's actually already 85 outside and the humidity is at 100%, they're going to lose the trust of their team very quickly. The flip side of that, though, is to say, look, we are in deep yogurt at the moment. We have a problem, but here are the things that we need to start doing. And by the way, if we start moving in that direction, we ought to be able to fight our way through this thing. I don't know whether we're here or here or here, but this is the direction we need to go, and making sure that people know if we all get to start moving in that direction, we will be able to do our vector checks and to be able to work out of this. And adapting to the change and uncertainty, because if you're talking about anything more than a very simple project, things change by the time you get there, and the answer that was a good answer on day one may not be. Or living in a world where you work for the government, what happens when sequestration is looming on the horizon, and how do you keep the world moving productively forward, and have a plan that can be both responsive to those kinds of things and yet actually makes good progress as you go forward. And it was interesting. We had lots and lots of arguments about this using intuition and sensing, because the people that are the anti-soft people in the world will say that doesn't mean anything. The judgers, but a lot of what that I think means is that what you need to have is enough experience to be able to say, if I don't have a complete set of data, or if I have data which is confusing in some way, I've got a lot of noise in the data, what's the composite of what that data? If I compile a lot of different things, how do I eliminate the false positives by using other data sets, and then figure out what's the right general approach to solving a problem. In terms of communication, I had the interesting job a few years ago of leading the mishap investigation for the Genesis mission, which was the one where the parachutes didn't open, and ended up both before that and after that probably reading 2 or 3 dozen mishap reports, and then of course as NASA chief engineer, all the mishap reports come through the office, so probably read a couple of dozen more. There was not one that I read that problems in communication weren't a part of the cause of the mishap. In almost every case, somebody within the team had the critical information, usually several somebodies, and somehow, some way, they didn't know the importance of it, or they didn't know who needed that information to get there, and so making that happen. So this is actually one of the ones that a lot of people will say they don't do well. Yeah, okay, I run a meeting and I make sure that the action items are clear, but this translates into making it's a two-way process, right? Is that as you explain a scenario, you explain an approach, particularly if you haven't had a detailed plan to work through. Why am I doing what I'm doing, and what's important about it? So now you have a number of brains in the room that are trying to reach the goal, not trying to execute the task that you laid out, because they know where you're trying to get to, not what you asked to be the first step. A lot of that is personal interaction. I can't tell you how frustrated I get when I see the email trails, and somewhere I'd love to have a stock message that says, stop, please walk down the hall and talk to each other, right? Email just doesn't have the bandwidth for an awful lot of things that we talk about, and especially if you got to do some coaching, right? I know one of my early mentors at Goddard, he was famous that if you were walking down the hall and he heard your voice, he would stick his head out of the office and he'd do like that, and you knew that you were about to have some wisdom imparted to you. But you know, he closed the door and he told you what you really should have been doing when you were doing that, but it was always in a way of, hey, you can do better than you're doing. Just think about this one a little bit. But it was important it happened in a closed door, and other people weren't part of it. Open and honest communication, and that goes back to raising your hand and saying, do we have a problem here? And sometimes the answer is, yeah, no, we have a solution for that. This was this other thing you didn't know about. Sometimes it's we really need to be going a different way. Just real quick, the other day, probably some of you are familiar with our MBD Vector small satellite mission. We were in the process of the last stages of deploying that out and turning it over to Special Operations Command. And we had a not very good weekend with network outages and stuff, and we had a bunch of glitches, and so we were in a discussion one night. We had 2 nights left to get down to Virginia Beach, get the equipment set up, and get a collect. And the question is, did we spend one of those checking everything out here and making sure it was good before we put people on the road? Everybody was of a mind, let's stay here. And one guy raised his hand and he said, look, we've done this a dozen times, we've made this work, and if we get down there tomorrow and we have the simplest possible glitch, like we forgot a cable, we're done. We're gone. Well, the team stepped back and he says, yeah, you're probably right. Let's get on the road, get people down there. They got down there. It turned out they had a security clearance problem. They got there at 3 o'clock, had to shut up at 4 o'clock, and didn't get their work done. And we would have been done if that had been the second day. So it's as simple as, guys, we're headed down a path where we have no back out, and that kind of conversation is important. And storytelling and analogies. Hardest part, we had a chief knowledge officer at most of the centers in NASA, and the question is always, how do you get what's buried in somebody's brain out of that brain and into somebody else's brain, right? And that is remarkably hard to do. There are probably thousands of lessons learned databases, and probably only a tiny fraction of them actually get read with any regularity. And usually after the fact, when somebody said, I wonder if there was something in there, right? And yet, people all the time will show up for storytelling, right? If you put people in a room and they have somebody that either had a terrible disaster or they averted a terrible disaster and snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, people want to listen to those. So maybe that's something that's burned into our DNA. With at a time when we were sitting around the fire listening to stories about how you eluded that hyena that was out there in the bush waiting for you or something. And of course, comfortable with making decisions. Obviously, you've got to be able to do that. So, and on the leadership end, and some of these are touched in other places, but creating the vision and direction. So getting a group of people that are not just working to letters of requirements and task statements, but actually know where you're trying to go. In the space business, what you see almost all the time with a team is that when a team first comes together at the beginning, they are actually not very effective because they're all working to task statements, they're all working to statements of requirements, and somewhere in there, the light bulb goes off, we're going to Pluto, right? And the attitude changes. That because all of a sudden the job is not to develop the power system, the job is not to develop the fault control system, the job is we're going to Pluto. Okay? I had the same thing, it happens in other places too. My daughter is a newly minted nurse, struggled when her first pass through when she ended up with a BS in psychology and English, because when she was taking organic and anatomy and all these other things, she was struggling with all those courses. and that blew her aspirations of going to med school out of the water. After she got out and turned around and said, you know, I think I want to be a nurse, she was taking the same courses as her prereqs for getting into nursing school and acing them. I mean, you know, absolute, you know, best grade in the class. And I said, so what's the difference? I said, Dad, when you know you're going to be using this daily in your professional life and a patient is going to be depending on it, that's not the same thing as trying to get a grade. And that's, you know, that's that same thing. It's that vision and that's that commitment that we get, and building that quickly into a team is critical. Seeing the situation objectively, appreciates and recognizes others. I mean, that's, you know, I don't think you can say thank you too many times as long as it's done sincerely and with meaning for something that's actually important. Understands the human dynamics of the team. You know, knowing how people react. You know, a powerful mechanism that a lot of people use when you're getting into a critical decision is having the discussion meeting and then not making the decision in real time in the meeting, but going back and saying, this is where I think we're going to go. These are the things we're probably going to decide on or sort through tomorrow or next week or whatever the right timing is, and then sending everybody away, because there are some people that are in the moment thinkers and they are the extroverts, and they'll raise their hand and say, that's more important than that. There's some other person that's digesting that problem and they're not really certain of what they think, and as they have a chance to think about that overnight, they'll come back in the morning and say, you know what, this one is the more important one than that, and then you'll have a chance to get. But understanding how your team works, because sometimes you can have a team that's just fine. Sometimes you can't wait the overnight. You got to, you know, decide, but then I'll leave the door open for folks and say, if we made a mistake, come back and tell me. Possesses the influencing skills. How many people have ever had a job when they had all and absolute authority to do everything they needed to do to execute the job? Yeah, me either. How many people have ever have had one and only one boss? Right? We don't live in that world, right? There's always things you got to influence, and even if you think you have authority, as some of you may know Tom Young, who was Center Director at Goddard for a while, Vice President at Lockheed for a long time, pretty august thinker. He said, his delegation letters to people always said, nothing in this delegation letter relieves you from the responsibility to fully coordinate your decision. So, you know, you're always working up. Coaching and mentoring, because, you know, particularly when you get into, you know, spaceflight projects that are lasting 4 or 5 years, most people in the team will not have the same job at the end that they had in the beginning. So how do you grow them into that, that next one, or in the next project that you're working on for that? And then delegating and ensuring that the resources are available. So it was this was an interesting conversation for us. So I think that that we actually made a difference. Interestingly enough, I'll let you read this quote, and I'll take a few guesses of who that quote might have been from, but it's not a particularly recent one. So. Any guesses? It's one of the big names in the space business. Nope. What? Wernher von Braun. So you kind of wouldn't think that, right? Because I mean, this picture you have of von Braun was, you know, this luminary, and he called the shots, and everybody did what he wanted. But it's an interesting quote from his book, and actually, when you talked with people that that worked with him, that's really the way he operated. You know, everybody knew that that he had pretty strong ideas, and that they all knew that he knew the answer, but they also knew that that he needed their answers, and they were going to be part of that team. So with that, I will leave you at the Mike Griffin speech. I think should still be on the NASA website. I don't think have been in the business of purging it, and a lot of this other. If you go to the APPL, nasa.gov, There's a lot of these other reference materials that are on that. With that, I'll stop, take any questions, comments, and whatever.
Thank you. If you have any questions, we are live streaming over the web, so please wait for a microphone. Start with the first question right up front here.
Yeah.
You mentioned under communications, the communications within the team is the way I interpret it.
Yeah.
Would you say something about how the engineer has to communicate outside the team?
Oh, that's probably almost as critical, maybe sometimes more so. Depends on the job, of course. But particularly if you're talking about people that are the leadership of the team, absolutely critical that they be able to go outside, to be able to explain why they're doing, particularly when you have things that are not going exactly right, because the first thing you need to be able to make sure is that the people around you know that you've got a plan, that your team has got a plan, that you're executing the plan, that you're making progress against that plan, and especially so if things are not going really well. These are the steps we're doing to take out of it. So it can be anything from maintaining advocacy that you've already got to gaining advocacy that you don't have. But that's probably absolutely as critical. And there was actually another chart that's actually an interesting one. I think it's probably, so this is one I didn't throw in there. But you bring this up, is that particularly when you're talking about your plan for going forward, is you got to know who you're talking to, right? And you have to be able to talk to those people and explain to those people in a way that they can understand that. So if you're talking about the details of a system engineering plan and you're talking to very experienced peers, you're in a different world and in a different conversation than if you are talking to a stakeholder at NASA headquarters or in the DoD that really hasn't a clue what the V is, or why is a verification plan a critical thing to get done at this point in time. But you need to be able to talk to them in the way that they understand what it is that they need to know about the project. So you have to be able to put yourself in their shoes. It's actually a similar skill, though, to what you will have if you've got a junior member of the team, because you have to be able to explain to them as they're coming in. Maybe they're new to the space business. Maybe they're in a different role than they had. You have to be able to explain to them what you're doing and why in a way that they get it well enough that they're not just trying to follow orders, so that their brains actually are turning on and functioning. So.
This is Mike Curtis from Northrop Grumman. Why didn't the parachutes open on was it the Genesis probe?
Yeah.
And also, what was the communication and management failure, if it was that? And then didn't the sample survive, the astrogel sample survive the crash?
So I'll start with the end first. The curation team was able to work miracles because the samples were a combination of astrogel and very thin glass films that had been exposed to the solar wind and had ions embedded in them. The vast majority of those were broken. There was, interestingly enough, a very interesting, and frankly, I never found out for sure whether it was done intentionally, but I was told that it was at least partially intentionally, that the actual glass films that had been used were of different compositions, so they were able to actually look spectroscopically at the pieces of glass and match them up. And so they sorted through literally tens of thousands of shards of glass, sorted them out into the individual samples, sorted out the ones that had contamination from the ground on them, and were able to reconstruct enough of the samples to make the mission a scientific success. So, going back, the proximate cause of the mishap was that there was a small spring-loaded G switch that was in upside down. So the interesting part is the way it got in upside down was that they started, this was actually a Stardust heritage, and they'd actually gone through a heritage review and said, this is, we're going to build the same thing. We know what the changes we need to put in this. But what happened is that as they had a much more complicated set of mechanisms for swinging the samples out into the solar wind, had to add some FPGA-driven motor controllers, which started expanding electronics box to maintain spacecraft balance. They had to split into 2 boxes, which meant they had to reorient boxes. And in the process, so here's the situational awareness, right? In the process, the issue was they were way behind on developing these FPGA-based motor controllers. So they went and got the best electronics engineer that they had for developing these motor controllers, right? They handed him all of the previous card designs and said, you get these 2 boxes delivered. In the process of that, he handed that off to a packaging engineer who had the previous drawings. Somewhere in that process, when they actually had to rotate the box 90 degrees, which meant that the G switch then ended up from being out of plane of the card, it was in plane with the card, made the simple inversion translation. The drawing was, the hardware was built according to the drawing. Nobody ever really thought about the fact that they had actually done this packaging. If you'd given it to an experienced mechanical engineer, they would have looked at the drawing and said, it's backwards, right? Because they're used to looking at they know the drawing nomenclature, arrows in, arrows out, whatever it is, and they would have gotten it. That didn't happen, okay? So there were some breakdowns in that process with that big a reconfiguration and not doing that kind of a peer review. But there were also problems within the team. So for example, they got trapped into, when we talked about solving the right problem, right? Somewhere in that, somebody in a review board raised the question, said, the atmosphere isn't actually smooth, it's lumpy. And so you expect that these things are going to not, come in with a smoothly built-in G field, that you're going to get some vibration in there. And then they started down the rat hole of trying to figure out what the environment looked like, and how in the world do you do a test to actually simulate that so you can find out that the G switch isn't bouncing and doesn't trigger at the right time, or what do you have to put for filters in your timing circuit. And they got way deep into that process and realized that they didn't have enough knowledge about the input to have any kind of a sensible test. And oh, by the way, even if you had a sensible test, it's so complicated and so expensive that you just can't do it. In the middle of that process, they completely lost sight of the fact that the simple test that was done on Stardust, which was stick the box on the spin table that you'd use, just the box on the spin table you used for the spacecraft, and spin it and make sure that the G switch actually closes once you spin it up, and that test never got done. Okay, and then there were other breakdowns within the process when people that looked at things and they assumed that other folks had actually looked at them and approved them, or they were doing a requirements traceability, and there are a couple of places where the requirements were ambiguous and nobody raised their hand and said, so what does this mean? They simply assumed that somebody else that actually knew what that was supposed to mean had actually reviewed it. So there were multiple places like that. Yeah, sure.
You said earlier that you had social scientists come in and look at it, and you were looking at sort of team dynamics a little bit, and how some people can make decisions very quickly and in the moment, and other people need to go off and think about it. Did the team look at the impact of the various personality types, like from Myers-Briggs and DISC, and how that affects team building and dynamics when you put teams together, and whether that makes a better system, certain personality types make a better systems engineer?
Not in the sense of how do you overtly go construct a team, but we definitely built that kind of thing into the training program so that as we were educating these future leaders, that they had an understanding of what the range of the personalities might be. I think you're, for better or for worse, and I think it's for better, you're going to generally live in a world where you're going to grab people because they know how to do that job. That doesn't mean, though, that you can just willy-nilly assume that they all have the same approach to things, or, I mean, some of these things are as simple as being sensitive to the fact that, you need to know that people actually have lives outside of work, and sometimes they can impinge on what they do. I'll go back to Genesis. One of the questions we asked ourselves, we said, so, it seemed like there were multiple opportunities for people to see things, find things, look at things, and understand that there was a problem, right? So we said, so who was the person that was the team lead above this electronics engineer that ended up with the packaging? So this was a very, very competent, dedicated woman. It was her first time as an electronic systems lead. So she was looking across this whole set of stuff the first time. It also happened that these events were occurring from about mid-December to about the first week in January over the Christmas holiday season. And they were in the middle of a spacecraft INT, and so she was pulling an extra shift as a test conductor because that was her previous job, and they were short-staffed, and they were pulling people in. So here you have a lady who's doing first time at a new job. You can just imagine she was doing that job for her, her normal shift, going in, pulling shifts as a test conductor, and then driving home at night trying to figure out what she's going to do about holidays with her family, right? And you say, does a person with that confluence of things going on in their life have any CPU power left for situational awareness? Probably not a lot, right? But yet we see situations like that all the time, and how many times do you actually overtly step back and say, we need to buy people some space, give them a chance to actually think. So,
before we get our next question underway, let's just see a show of hands. If you don't have a green ticket for the book drawing, just please raise your hand and Bob will get around to you. Any other questions? One in the back.
One in the back. If you want to...
Let's wait for the microphone, yeah.
Okay.
Space program.
Yeah.
All for 24 bolts on a tilt table, not bolted down, and somebody put a sign up, hey, I borrowed your 24 bolts.
Yep.
Busted that optical bench to begin with, and it was going through final test.
Yeah, we've seen that any number of
You can
times.
see in the background just stacks and stacks, and all marked off, all the particular tests, observations, and checklists, and everything else that everybody had to go through. Nobody made the most simplest one. The bolts weren't tied down to the satellite onto the bench.
Yep. And I'll bet you everybody's got at least one of those someplace, right? So, and if you haven't had one at work, you sometimes had a loose lug nut on your car someplace too. So, any other
questions?
Yep.
So how do we take this beyond NASA? And for instance, this organization does hold symposiums and things. How can we encourage, especially more of the right brain art side of engineering?
So I think one of the things is making sure that we keep having that kind of conversation. So when you have conversations about what does it take to become a systems engineer, you can have the conversations. Yeah, it's great to have a master's degree, but that's not enough if you're going to actually be asked to lead a team in doing a complicated job of some kind. So so how do you get up the experience curve of doing that? What are the right sets of jobs for people to take on? Is there coaching that you might want to offer people? With the SELDP System Engineering Leadership Development Program, this was a work assignment in a completely different area than one they had been, but it was also coupled with a pretty intensive evaluation of where, against these attributes that we had illuminated, and say what are the things they need to work on. So not that they would be finished, but that they would have made a start, and they would have an awareness so that they knew that they needed to be thinking about how they communicated with their teams, when they saw other people doing it, that they would say, ah, there's a really good example of somebody explaining why they made the decision they made. That's something I could do, and having that awareness so that they could be able to constantly be building their skills and then putting them into jobs where they can show that they're doing that. So I think it's having those conversations. I think part of it can help with the professional organizations in making sure that we have both conversations. How do you get the technical knowledge, the coursework, the PMI certifications, but what are the other things that you need to be doing to build your skill set in leading teams? And then as we go back into our work environments, making sure that we're having those kinds of conversations as we're establishing teams, as we're picking people to go on teams, doing their first leadership jobs in a small team, and make sure that we're actively trying to grow them. And sometimes it may be you need to find the people and do the little thing with a finger and call them into your office and say, you know what, not a bad meeting, but you had a couple of people over here that weren't engaged. So maybe you need to think about why they weren't engaged, or why they were having the conversation in the hallway outside about why you made the wrong decision, instead of having that one in the room when you could have had it there.
Thank you very much. If you can go back to one slide, I think you had
Sure.
the AAPL link. Yeah, the
Oops.
further reading slide. I apologize.
Yeah, I'm going forward, aren't I? The website is. The website's open. Oh, come on. There it is.
Yeah, and I think that's where you have all the system engineering competency
Yeah.
levels.
That whole
and all
framework
that
is.
talks about the framework between levels and the job roles.
And we actually, the
how to
conversation.
move to the next level and things like that. So that's really valuable reading. Everybody should take a look at that. Before we close out, I did want to kind of offer a thank you, an extreme and gracious thank you to our host here at APL. By a show of hands, how many APLers do we have in the crowd? Great number. Big draw.
Yeah, good.
All right, we're going to get to the closing of our
The important
evening.
part is
Everybody's
the
got
giveaway.
it. Yes, exactly. Everybody's got to get their ticket out. We're not going to make this one.
I have to be blind justice?
No, you can look. Well, let's fix it.
Okay.
I like the book. So
Okay.
there's 2 tickets here.
Oh, sorry.
Drawing. This is somebody's going to cry foul.
You weren't very clear on the requirements there.
That's right. It's one ticket.
One ticket.
Please.
Okay.
My communication was. Just to let everybody know that Mike gave me the test before this, and I aced every one of those areas. So. Okay, everybody, break out the ticket. It's 224 94. I heard some ahs in the back. Okay, 941. Great job, Bob.
I've got it. Good. So when do we get the book report? I will promise you that book will bend your brain. So. Oh. We got to stand still if he's going to take a picture. Okay.
And as always, we don't let our speakers go away empty-handed. As a token of our appreciation, the certificate. This is actually worth at least one free lunch here at APL. So post it high and up in your office.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you very much. Great. Thank you.
And our Nkosi Chesapeake chapter coffee mug. Oh wait, it's not a coffee mug. It's a caffeine delivery system.
Okay. Two-handed, left-handed, and right-handed, right? I got that. So.
Once again, everyone, thank you, and come on back next month. We're going to have another great speaker, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. Enjoyed it.